It was 1995. I had just graduated high school. An old friend who I haven't talked to in 7 years now and I were hanging out, and I said, "Let's go to New Orleans." And we did. We had $140 between us, and back then, that was more than enough. We made it to New Orleans, almost died from culture shock, and turned around and headed to Magnolia, Mississippi to get some sleep. We stayed at Magnolia Inn. It was a shithole, but it was nice and cool. It was May or June. In South Mississippi, cool was the only adjective that mattered. We stayed up that night playing poker, drinking Gordon's vodka, and talking about who knows what. Probably girls, college girls. At some point I even said, "Ever been to Texas?" "Nope." "Pack your bag and let's roll." We had a road atlas. Marshall, Texas was right across the border from Shreveport. We arrived in Shreveport, made a phone call to another friend who we were actually supposed to be staying with. Both of our mothers had been calling, looking for us. The only person that knew where we were was the buddy on the phone. It was no big deal. We would be home in a day or two. I'm being short on details because if I don't, this will turn into a novel-length story about chasing armadillos and being chased by the boogeyman. Before we left the rest area in Shreveport where we made the call, we saw an armadillo. Let me tell you something about armadillos. Those bastards will hiss, jump, and turn into Tasmanian devils if you corner them. They also carry leprosy. We were 18. We chased that armadillo around for an hour. Now let me tell you about Shreveport. I don't know how it is now, but in the summer of 1995, it looked and smelled like a place where oil and metal went to die. It was dirty. It was a shithole. We crossed a bridge and saw people fishing 100 yards from where a drainage pipe from a factory was spewing forth waste upriver from the fishermen. The locals reminded me of the locals in Adamsville, bald-headed women and cross-eyed men. A lot of bald-headed, cross-eyed kids. I'm sorry, but it was a Rob Zombie movie come to life. I felt like I was going to be raped because I had a full head of hair and could see straight. The best part of Shreveport was an armadillo that might possibly have leprosy. Marshall, Texas was 40 miles away. We rolled on. Marshall was a decent little town, home of the Fire Ant Festival. We stopped at a little barbecue joint and had a Coke, a smile, and some pulled pork. It was getting late and the sun was setting. We looked at the map and decided to backtrack a bit and head up rural Route 43 through Karnak and past Cato Lake. We eventually would run into Highway 59, head to Texarkana, and then head back home. When we left the barbecue joint and headed back towards 43, it was dusk. Highway 43 wasn't well lit. It was almost as dark as Notch's Trace Parkway. I've got a good story about using a pair of pantyhose as a fan belt for an old diesel Mercedes. Do not ever get stuck on the trace after dark. My friend was driving and we were doing about 45 miles per hour. Any faster would have been reckless, even for a couple 18-year-old dumbasses. This road was kind of like Christmasville Road. The locals reading this will know what I mean. The non-locals just have to use your imagination. It was dark, winding, full of hills that ended in curves. There were beady and glowing eyes on both sides of the road. You could hear the crickets and the bullfrogs over the sound of the wind rushing by the old Sentra. It was peaceful and creepy at the same time. The humidity was a real thing, tangible. The air was thick. It smelled like pastures, hay, and swamp. We drove for what seemed like hours. It was after midnight, and I saw a sign that informed me that Bivens was the next town of any size. I was hypnotized by the yellow lines on the road. We hadn't seen another car in at least an hour. I rolled the window down and lit a cigarette. There was music coming from the radio, the tape player. It was either Tupac or Bob Seger. I smoked my cigarette, absent-mindedly flicking ashes out the window. I took one last puff and flicked the Camel short off into the woods. Then I saw it. I never looked to my right. I didn't even kind of peek to the right. Maybe I did a little when I flicked the cigarette away. I don't know why. What I do know is that in my periphery, there was something running alongside the car. It was just behind my window, behind where the edge of the door ends and where the back window begins. I looked over at the speedometer, 40 miles per hour. I looked at my friend. He was looking straight ahead. I looked straight ahead. I could still see it. I could see one huge arm, matted hair, reddish-brown, sticky-looking primal. I eased my right hand over and rolled up my window. My friend was still looking straight ahead. His jaw was clenched, and he put both his hands on the wheel. He sped up. No words were said. I looked straight ahead, and still out of my periphery I could see that arm moving. Muscles and tendons visibly rippling beneath that matted hair. As the car gained a little speed, the thing running alongside us lost pace slightly. I then saw the hand on the end of the nightmarish arm. The hand was clenched into the fist the size of a cantaloupe, a big cantaloupe. It was covered in the same hair but slightly darker around the fingers, like it was strained with something. Suddenly, the hand unclenched, and then I saw the claws, black as the damned after midnight Texas night. Those claws were at least 2 inches long, sharp like an animal's. This wasn't a hand so much as it was the killing paw and claws of some beast whose only purpose was to kill and eat. I looked at my friend. I looked at the speedometer. 50 miles per hour. I looked straight ahead. It was still there. I lit another cigarette, didn't roll the window down, and simply said, "Shit." The music had stopped. I finally broke the silence and said, "Hey, do you?" And before I could finish, my buddy said, "I see it. I've been seeing it. I can't even see you, but I can see whatever the hell that shit is." "How much do you see it?" "More than I want to." "Speed up, John. Just speed up. It can't keep up forever." I looked over. 55 miles per hour. Whatever was chasing us, silently, was starting to lag behind. I finally looked to my right, just a bit. Imagine the scary part of the movie where you put your hands in front of your face but still peek through. In 37 years, I have 2 regrets. One is picking up that first cigarette, and the other is me looking to my right that night. The beast was huge. Its chest was above the top of the car, and all I could see was that matted reddish-brown hair. Then it bent forward as it ran. I saw the face of this thing. All reality stopped. We were no longer driving down some country road in Texas. We were now trying to escape from the depths of a monster-inhabited hell. This thing's face is beyond my powers to describe. It was evil. The eyes were black and the pupils were red. It flashed its teeth at me in a snarl, yellow and huge. Saliva dripped from its mouth. It opened its eyes wide, and it looked hungry and pissed off. Then it opened its mouth. The skin pulled back until all you could see were black gums and yellow teeth. I immediately could feel the car accelerate. "Fucking hell, John, just go." I prayed. I cussed. I lit a cigarette. Then, like sunshine breaking through the clouds, the road straightened down. "Don't you slow down." We drove through Bivens, and we drove to Texarkana. Then we drove home. We never said a word. It was years later, 11 to be exact, before we ever even talked about it again, and we didn't talk about it much. He said he'd never told anyone, and I hadn't either. I told this story a few years back for the first time while I was parked out on a gravel road, doing the things you do when you're parked out on a gravel road with a good-looking woman. I told it a year or so ago to a couple of kids who wanted to hear a scary story while they sat around a campfire. They didn't sleep for a day or two, but they asked me a dozen more times to tell them this story. I never told anyone until now that I saw its face. I've been scared for my life exactly 2 times. Once was on that road, and once was looking at a grizzly bear in front of me with a terminal velocity inducing drop to the side of me. Call it what you will, call it bullshit if you want, but look me in the eyes and let me tell you this story and you'll know. Never doubt that there are things in this world that defy explanation and logic. The boogeyman is real. Some 16 or 17 years after this happened, I ran across a story and a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek. Falk, Arkansas, where the aforementioned story and movie takes place, isn't that far from Bivens, Texas, as the crow flies. Invite me over, buy me a beer, sit on the porch with me, and I'll tell you a story over a pack of Marlboros and a few of those beers. I don't consider myself to be a particularly superstitious person. Okay, sure, I get a kick out of the horoscope once in a while. My boyfriend and I like to humor the idea that spirits and poltergeists exist, and how we'd haunt people when we died and came back as ghosts. In fact, my boyfriend refuses to go anywhere near a Ouija board, refuses to even think of it. I blame all of the crummy horror movies he watches. Why even tempt it, he'd say. Why would you want to taunt evil ghosts like that? Ghosts never play fair, and if you piss one off, you're screwed. I don't think he was very serious, just precautionary. But maybe he was right. God, this all happened so long ago. I'm still shaken though. Can barely write about it now without my nerves acting up. Okay, here it goes. A few weeks ago, my mom, sis, and I went to Colorado for an entire week on vacation. We were going to drive all over the state, visit parks and go horseback riding and whitewater rafting and so much more. I was excited and I sorely needed a break from my work anyway. We drove 16 hours out there and spent our first day rafting down the rivers. After an exciting day, we drove to a ranch house to go horseback riding. We got there at sunset, so it was a little too late to ride, but we had all next day to ride the trails and see the sights. The ranch was, well, dumpy, all run down with scraps of steel everywhere, and the shoddy cabins that we were staying in were in desperate need for repair. I swear the roof over our shack of a cabin was a giant piece of drywall with shingles stapled to the top of it. My sister and I thoroughly checked the place for spiders and bugs before we even thought of bringing our luggage in. It was only for the night, I reassured myself. Just one night in a dumpy shack on a rock-hard bed that probably had bed bugs under the sheets. I shuddered at the thought. My mom tried to cheer us up. She had brought skewers and a pack of giant beef hot dogs to roast over the communal fire pit. Happy to get out of the shack, my sister and I made a nice cozy fire, and soon a few other people from the other cabins came to sit around the fire and roast s'mores and share stories. We talked about where we were from, where we were going, and our adventures along the way. Pretty soon, the stories turned into tales and urban legends and the sort of stuff you'd usually tell around a bonfire. That's when I spoke up. I loved stories, especially scary ones. And hey, we're out west, we're in a Native American territory. Why not liven up the place with my favorite Indian myth, the legend of the Skinwalkers. Now, for those of you who don't know, Skinwalkers are considered very evil, very dangerous beings. They were humans who gained the ability to take on the form of an animal by wearing its skin, usually through very dark and taboo magic. I knew all of this and told my story. Who doesn't love a good ghost story? Everyone seemed to be enjoying it. I admit I took some creative liberties with it, really just retelling an old werewolf story but with a skinwalker instead. I bullshitted a lot of the story, really, and added a few things that weren't in the mythos at all. I gave our beloved frightening skinwalker wide, crazy eyes with pinpoints for pupils with a matching insane smile. I made the skinwalker horribly misshapen with swollen joints and arms that were too long and legs that were too short and a head that never sat straight on its shoulders. I made it as terrifying as I could imagine. No one minded. They actually really liked it, and a man from Kentucky admitted the visuals alone were enough to creep him out. Victory in my book, if you ask me. And once I was done, everyone decided it was getting really late. Our firewood was dwindling, and it was a good time as any to turn in for the night. We packed up our skewers and s'mores, doused the fire, and headed to our little shacks. I tossed and turned a lot trying to fall asleep. Couldn't get comfortable on that damn bed. A rock was probably cozier than that mattress. So, against my better judgment, I got out of the bed and walked about the cabin. I reasoned that if I stayed up late enough, I would be so tired that I would fall asleep no matter what I was lying on. I think I briefly contemplated sleeping on the floor. I wasn't that desperate. Yet. It was pitch black outside, no lights from any nearby street lamps, no car headlights, hell, not even the cabin lights were on, and I don't even remember seeing a single star. It was a bit creepy, but I shrugged off the shiver creeping up my back as simply the cold tile floor making me shake. I did, however, find it odd that there weren't any lights on at all on the property. You'd think there'd be a floodlight on the horse stables or on the main office, but no, nothing. This was really weird. I stepped outside in my flimsy foam flip-flops to get a better look. I could barely make out the ranch, and for some stupid fucking reason, I decided to go walking around. Eventually, my eyes adjusted where I could see well enough to move around. I paced up and down the road where the cabin sat and circled around to the fence in the field where the horses were out, grazing. Except, there weren't any horses, probably in the stables for the night, I reasoned. I shivered again. It was getting awfully cold. I turned right around to head back to my own cabin. It was stupid of me to be out all alone at an obscene hour. I had realized I needed to get to bed. But when I turned, there was something in the middle of the road. Its shape was swallowed up by the surrounding darkness. I could barely make it out. It was tall and thin. I shrugged it off as just a pole or something else and kept walking, but then it moved. I froze. My breath caught in my throat and I could barely breathe. I just imagined that, I said. I just imagined it. I'm freaking myself out. Get your fucking head straight. It moved again. My paralyzed throat managed to squeak out a pathetically weak whimper as my legs began to lose strength. I shivered violently against the cold that was building up inside of me. My eyes began to focus on the impossibly dark figure standing against a barely visible sleet, gray night. Now, I could see it. It was a person, but like nothing I had ever seen before. Its arms were impossibly long, its legs impossibly short. It had a torso far too long for its rail-thin body, and a head much too big for its stick neck. Its right arm was sticking out to its side, swinging up and down. Its blockish head rolled onto its left shoulder, jerkily twitched up and down, up and down. It didn't move other than that. It just stood there, twitching, arms jerking up and down, head lolling around its shoulder. I still stood there like the dumb fuck I was. My cabin was a few hundred yards behind that thing, and I wasn't so stupid as to try to walk past it. My only option was to go around, behind the cabins and the stables, and hope it didn't see me. I forced myself to lift my foot off the ground and step backwards. My flip-flop made a wet smacking sound as it flopped against my feet, and I immediately froze in horror. The thing stopped, too. It stood there, perfectly straight, perfectly still, listening. I stayed as still as I could. My breath was shallow, and I panicked and I tried to force myself to slow my breathing before I started wheezing. My heart thundered in my chest. My whole body was shaking, but I didn't move. Neither did it. I began to slowly, so goddamn slowly, bend over and slipped my feet out of those fucking flip-flops. My feet touched the dirt and the crumbly gravel, but at least now I could move silently. I spared a quick glance to the side to see where I was going. 2 cabins were immediately to my right. I could slip between them with ease, and there was no visible debris between them. I only looked away for a second. When I turned back, that fucking thing was gone. It was fucking gone. It fucking knew I was there. It was coming for me. Oh fuck. Yet I still couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move no matter how loud my head screamed, "Run! Run!" I heard something behind me. I turned instinctively. Even though I knew better, I still turned around. I was greeted with 2 bulging eyes. Oh god, its eyes. Staring at me, unblinking with 2 black pinholes for pupils and an insane smile that was stretched far too wide for anything to be remotely human. My paralysis broke as I stared at that fucking thing. I ran. I fucking ran, crying my eyes out, trying to scream, but a horrible lead weight in my throat silenced me. My feet pounded on the dirt. I stomped over anything in my way. I even impaled my foot on a sharp rock. I didn't even care. I just ran. I felt the cold creeping up my back. Oh God, the cold. It was sinking right into my bones and I couldn't stop shaking or sobbing. I didn't stop until I burst through the cabin doors and deadbolted the lock and leaped into my bed. I huddled under the blankets, hiding my head there, and I gasped and shook for breath. And I waited. I didn't sleep the entire night. I was too scared. I couldn't get rid of the chill. All I thought about was that thing standing there and twitching. Morning finally broke, and I finally allowed myself a breath of relief. Whatever I had seen had not come for me, and now that it was light, it couldn't take me by surprise. Mom noticed my bleeding foot and the blood I tracked in through the cabin. I shrugged it off, said I cut myself the night before when we were making s'mores. I don't think she believed me, but she didn't push. We left not long after that. And as we left, I looked at the place where that thing once stood, and I shuddered again. But there was nothing. I assured myself. There was nothing. We said goodbye to the ranchers and to our companions, and I noticed the man from Kentucky who said he thoroughly enjoyed my story. He told me again how much he liked it, said he was going to tell it to his own kids when he got home. They really like scary stories, he said, and as we drove away, his head rolled onto his left shoulder, and he smiled a wide, insane smile as he waved us goodbye. I live on a reservation. I'm almost 19 now. I was 17 at the time, and it's always been a standing rule that we can't leave our house after sunset. There's always been bad things happening. People going missing, animals going missing, animals showing up, and mutilated animals. Weird stuff. I was allowed to have a few friends over for my birthday party. I was really excited because this land is beautiful and I always like to show it off. 3 of my friends made it up here, 2 boys and a girl. I'll just refer to them as Boy 1, Boy 2, and Girl 1. We went for a long walk up the mountain, a little ways from the reservation because the view up there is amazing, and even though it was getting on dusk, I figured we'd be fine. There's 4 of us all in a group together, and we've got hiking sticks with the spears at the end, and it's only a 20-minute walk there and back. Boy 1 saw the end of a goat, but it was missing a tail, and it looked injured. We tried to get closer to see if it was alright, because all the goats around these parts are owned, but as we got closer, it made a really loud, low bleat and ran over the ridge. Boy 1 and I ran off the track after it and looked over the ridge. It disappeared. We stopped so we could hear which direction it was running to, but there was no noise at all. I thought it was a bit weird, and the sun was disappearing faster than I thought, so we started to head back. My friends would always laugh at the rules my family has about going outside at night, but they were about to find out why we have that rule, and I was about to get a fresh reminder. Boy 1 was leading us with his phone light. It wasn't that dark that we couldn't see in front of us, but the trail has drops and rocks, and because of the bushes to the sides of us, it made it really hard to see our feet. There was this giggle in front of us. We stopped, because it was really close. It sounded like a turkey gobble, which is uncommon in my area. It happened a few more times after that. The sound gave me goosebumps because it didn't sound right at all. The next thing we saw still plays with my head. Going from left to right across the path was this thing. My heart jumped into my throat. It looked like a large coyote, but its limbs were mutilated like it was a cross between a human with sharp long claws. Its face looked distorted and human, but it was animalistic at the same time. And it had really long teeth. The scariest part is the way it moved. It was rocking back and forth on all fours like a praying mantis. It'd just take a step back and rock backwards and forwards and then lurch another step forward. Its head was bowed down in between its shoulders. None of us moved for what seemed like a couple of minutes, just watching it jolt itself across the path. It looked like it was just going to go past us and leave us alone until the girl started crying and freaking out. The animal flung its head in her direction and made a really low growl, sort of like a house cat, because it had the voice behind it as well. It twisted its body around and started coming at us. It was terrifying. I yelled and threw down my spear at its head, but it was like it bounced off. When it got to me, it stood up. It was so tall. It barged into me, making me fall down. It started hiccuping and lurching, and then it barged into boy 1. It backed into boy 2, and he landed in a ditch just off the trail. There was hardly any light on us now. When it got to the girl, it contorted its body over the top of her head and held her down. She started screaming. Boy 2 got up and hit it with his hiking pole, hard. It jolted away from the path behind us, making a crying noise, almost like it was mocking the girl. It was playing with us. We picked ourselves up and ran as fast as we could back down the path and across the reservation to my place. We told my mom what happened, and she told me and my friends the legend of the Skinwalkers. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to a crying sound outside that would stop just as my ears adjusted to being awake. I don't want to look outside my curtains. I never want to see its face again. The girl said when it was on her, it was hissing in her ear, and it was whispering things to her that she didn't understand. I still get nightmares. This story was told to me by one of my good friends who's of Navajo descent on her father's side. It happened several years ago when she was spending the last 2 weeks of summer visiting relatives on a reservation in New Mexico, and is by far one of the creepiest things I've ever heard. My friend, Jessie, was 12 at the time and playing outside with her cousins. They were tossing a frisbee around and one of the younger kids threw it too hard. It flew over the fence and was swallowed up by the small grove of parched burk oak trees. Jessie, being the eldest, went to retrieve it, leaving her 11-year-old cousin Ellie in charge until she got back. The sun was setting, lighting up the sky in brilliant shades of orange as Jessie made her way over to the grove. After some poking around, she found the frisbee caught in one of the tree's branches. As she climbed, she began to sing an old Navajo song, but paused when her body suddenly went cold. That's exactly how Jessie described it to me. Cold, as if she'd been dunked in ice water. You know that annoying, scary story cliche, a feeling like you're being watched? Well, it's only cliche because it's true. Jessie could feel a pair of eyes following her even when she looked around and saw nothing. Seriously creeped out, she grabbed the frisbee and ran back to her grandmother's house just in time to see the old woman step onto the porch and call for the children to come inside. The true horror didn't start until 7 hours later. Jessie, her cousin Ellie, and Ellie's little sister Clara were asleep in their grandmother's guest room when Jessie woke up to the strangest sound she'd ever heard. She described it to me as a cross between radio static and the noise an old movie reel makes. At first, it sounded distant, but after a minute or two, Jessie realized it was getting closer. Beside her, Ellie rolled over and muttered, "What is that?" "Don't know," Jessie whispered. The girls waited, holding their collective breath. By now, the sound was right outside the window, and Jessie realized it was singing. At this point in her retelling of the story, Jessie went white and began glancing over her shoulder. She told me the song was the exact same one she'd been singing in the tree grove earlier. It sounded so wrong, she said, rubbing her arms as if a cold breeze had rushed by her. Remember when we listened to that clip of the very first recording of a human voice? How weird it sounded. When I nodded, Jessie added, "It was like that, but a little clearer. Somehow, that made it even worse." Jessie and Ellie were both terrified, while Clara, unaware, slept on. Through the thin blue curtain over the window, they could see the dark shadow of something peering in at them. To this day, Jessie can't explain what motivated her to get up and see for herself since she was scared shitless. Ignoring Ellie's protests, she slid out of the bed and walked across the room on shaky legs. As soon as she drew back the curtain, she regretted her decision. Staring back at her was the most horrifying creature she'd ever seen. It had the head of an emaciated deer with antlers like dead tree branches and eyes so black they seemed to absorb the faint silver moonlight. It had a scrawny humanoid body with abnormally long arms and legs, and as Jessie stood there, caught in its hideous gaze, it raised a claw hand and scratched at the window with a horrible screeching sound that made Jessie's skin crawl. It was Ellie's scream that jolted Jessie out of her terrified stupor. She stumbled back from the window and landed on the carpet floor. Clara woke up and began screaming too. Then their grandmother ran in and turned on the light. The thing at the window had vanished, leaving behind 3 long scratches in the glass and 3 terrified little girls. Jessie's grandmother managed to calm the hysterical children enough so they could tell her what happened. As she listened, her age-weathered face became progressively paler. She hustled the girls downstairs to the living room and made a bed for them on the couch. She then sat by them all night, and whenever one of them asked her what was going on, the old woman simply shook her head. Needless to say, Jessie and her cousins didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jessie's grandmother announced that everyone was to stay inside that day. No arguments. She looked so shaken, nobody dared to protest. Around noon, she called for a medicine woman to come and bless the home. Later, after the woman left, Jessie marched into the kitchen where her grandmother was loading the dishwasher. "Tell me what that thing was," she said bluntly. Her grandmother sighed and motioned for Jessie to sit down. "You've heard the legend of the Skinwalkers, yes?" Jessie frowned and nodded, vaguely recalling the story. "So, that was a Skinwalker?" Her grandmother nodded, yes. "Grandma," said Jessie as the light dawned, "I think it overheard me singing in the tree grove yesterday." Her grandmother's dark eyes narrowed. "Why do you say that?" "Because it was singing that same song. You know, the lullaby you used to sing to me when I was little." Her grandmother was silent for a long time before whispering, "You are a very lucky girl, Jessica, but luck has its limits. From now on, you must be more careful." The look in the old woman's eyes as she spoke those words still haunts Jessie to this day. As I said earlier, this was years ago, 7 to be specific. Jessie has returned to the reservation many times, each without incident, but she's never set foot on that tree grove again, and probably never will. Jessie's grandmother died this past March at the age of 87, and Jessie later moved in with her aunt for the summer so she could help clean up the old house which the family was going to rent out. She'd been there for about a week when I went down there to visit her. On my first night, we sat on the porch and drank some beers, and I found my eyes drifting towards the tree grove. "So that's where it all happened." Jessie shuddered and nodded. "Yup, tomorrow I'm taking you to the medicine woman and have her bless you. Is that really necessary?" The look Jessie gave me nearly turned me to stone. "You think nothing will happen to you because you're white, but when you're in Navajo territory, you're in Skinwalker territory. Take caution." I nodded, yes. That night, I swore I heard radio static outside the house. When I brought it up to Jessie the next morning, she didn't speak, but grabbed my arm and practically dragged me to the medicine woman, where I was blessed. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip, and I went back to the city unscathed. I didn't post this here with the intention of teaching a moral, but I suppose if there is something to be learned from the story of the Singing Skinwalker, it's that there are things out there we can't explain. The look in Jessie's eyes when she recounted her experience told me everything I needed to know. What she saw truly horrified her, and all I can say is I'm grateful I didn't have to go through it myself.